What is up, everyone? Dan the Cardman back again. Today we're talking through PPP loans once again. Specifically, we're going to touch on this Geoff Wilson Sports Card Investor response video. I'm going to talk through a few things on that. I'm going to highlight a few things based on my line of work. So if some of you do know, but some don't know, that in my line of work, I basically deal with the highest level of financial institutions with this sort of stuff. So, I see it day in, day out. I saw it basically at the peak of the pandemic. So I'm going to share my insights on that, highlight what I believe has happened, what I think has happened, some things that I think you all need to keep front of mind when you're looking at this situation with Sports Card Investor. We'll then also talk through some of these other trading card businesses, because keep in mind, this PPP loan for Geoff Wilson and one of his companies is not trading card related. But I'm going to highlight some of these other trading card businesses that got this money that I think needs to be talked about, because currently they're so happy counting their chickens because nobody's talking about them. Everybody's focused on SCI when they should be looking at these trading card businesses who, more than likely, I shouldn't say more than likely, is a good chance that some of them committed hanky-panky, right? I'm not going to name names on which ones I think did that, but I think we need to focus on all of them together. So we'll get to that a little bit later on as well. Now, as I said, the first thing I want to touch on is this Sports Card Investor video that came out one day ago. It's basically his response to Sports Card Radio with regards to the PPP loans. And he essentially explained that his other business is not trading card related. They did everything above board, so on and so forth, and basically explained his situation. Now, he's copying a lot of hate for this video. I think it was good to see a response from him personally. Again, the optics of the situation are not very good for him, but I'm going to share my thoughts on that a little bit later as well. One thing I do want to flag up front, now, if you go to Sports Card Radio's Instagram, I think it's probably gone now because it's past the 24 hours. But essentially, they said on the original PPP video, Geoff Wilson left a comment and then they deleted it. So Sports Card Radio was saying that Sports Card Investor deleted this comment, and they're saying, why did you delete the comment? So I asked some people from Sports Card Investor, so to give you some context, a month or so ago when I did my card porn video and I mentioned Geoff Wilson's name, some contacts reached out from the investor channel and basically said, Daniel, if you ever have any questions, just ask us, right? We'll be more than willing to support or help you clarify some questions before you make some videos. So I asked them about the deleted comment. They said they did not delete the comment. They said Sports Card Radio did. So you've basically got a he said, she said situation. Believe who you want in that situation. I think the most likely situation, if neither of those did delete the comment, is that YouTube probably, automated the deletion of that. And I'll give you some examples as to why. So sometimes on my videos, I have some controversial opinions. People share their views. They'll leave a comment, and then the comment section can get pretty heated sometimes. So people become quite rude to each other. And what I have found is that somebody's left like a normal comment, and then the replies have been incredibly negative, swear words, so on and so forth, saying very vile things. And because of that, the whole comment section gets taken out. So that original comment goes because of the replies. Now, some of you might not believe that, but I've seen that firsthand. So that could have been what occurred in this situation. I just wanted to flag that up front. Now, in terms of what Geoff talks about in this video, there's a few things that I want to clarify with regards to some of the questions people are saying, right? So people are saying, well, Geoff, your business isn't trading card related, but why couldn't you fund this out of your own pocket? And he talks about this a little bit in his video, but you guys need to understand, when you've got two businesses, okay, he can't transfer funds between each other given there might be some existing debt covenants between them, right? And that means that if you've got a loan as a business, you can't then lend somebody else money until your original loan is fulfilled. So there's also that reason why he can't transfer funds between businesses, but it's also, like he mentions in his video, that they've got very different ownership structure, so it's not as simple, right? And you can believe that or not, yes, there are ways around that sort of stuff, but that might be one of the reasons why it hasn't occurred. It's also worth mentioning as well, Geoff Wilson as an owner, I'm not sure how many other owners are part of his non-trading card related business. I think it's 352. I'm dyslexic, so there's too many numbers there. I probably got it mixed up. But essentially, if he's got his own loans, right, as an individual, or got loans where he's the sole trader with some of his other businesses, okay, the one owner, the one director, the one partner, he might not be able to take out an additional loan other than the PPP loan to fund that, right? So this is the same sort of thing with the debt covenants that I just mentioned. If you're not sure what a debt covenant is basically, a contract that you have with a bank that basically says you cannot lend money or you cannot borrow money from anybody else until you give us our own money back, right? And that's basically the simple way of explaining it. There's a few other instances that need to be clarified that nobody's talked about either, right? So I'm an accountant. There's this thing called the going concern, right? This sounds a bit weird in terms of what the term actually means, but essentially it means that, a business has to maintain a going concern, right? And that means that they've got enough liquid assets, liquid cash, to make sure that they can operate for at least the next 12 months, right? And that's one of the big checks we do as auditors. Now, what can often happen if a director gives funding to a business, and if, as Geoff explained, his business was struggling to the point where they needed this loan, if they didn't get this loan, they would have collapsed. If in that instance, a director is the one giving some money to that business, that business can then fail the going concern test, which means they can no longer operate as an entity, right? And that can happen sometimes. It doesn't happen often, but that is also a potential occurrence for why, he didn't use his own funds to support that business as opposed to taking that loan. But I think the most important thing that needs to be understood here that nobody's really talking about is that there are mandatory audits associated with the PPP loans, right? And some of you might say, well, I did know that, I didn't know that. Well, what that basically means, and the threshold is $2 million, either individually or in aggregate. Now, I didn't flag this in my last video, the exact dollar figure. I did flag it in my Instagram story. But because these two loans in aggregate went over $2 million, it means irrespective of whether he did anything right or wrong, his PPP loan would go through this mandatory audit. What does that entail? It basically is a detailed third-party audit where people come in and inspect what the funds were used for. Was the business actually struggling? Are the things you reported to us complete, accurate, and correct, essentially? So if any hanky-panky happened on that end, it would have been flagged. Now, the other thing that's worth mentioning, it's not just the audit, the mandatory audit coming in, but it's also an additional review that occurs on the forgiveness portion. So when the forgiveness check does occur, basically, they would come in and say, you know what, tell us why this loan needs to be forgiven. Is your business still in a struggling state? So on and so forth. So they would have done all those inspections, all those checks then, which, leads me to believe that everything within this instance was above board, right? And obviously I'm not the auditor on this specific, inspection on his account, but that's what I'd imagine they're going to find, right? Because it's above the threshold, all the checks and balances would have occurred. The one question you would have on this instance is the optics of the situation. As people have flagged, he's basically out, buying cards, spending money. There's basically a Google Sheets out there that explains how much money he's actually spent. And I think Sports Card Radio themselves, have flagged in a video earlier today. And again, the optics of that are not good at all. But there are other instances that could be factoring into that as well. And one thing that I would love to get a response on, that I've asked the guys from Sports Card Investor that I haven't got an answer from yet, just given the time zone difference, and I want to get this video out there because some of the talking points I just flagged I think need to be spoken about. But essentially, I've asked them whether or not the cards being bought under Sports Card Investor as Geoff's PC cards actually being bought with his own money, or are they being bought with, Sports Card Investor, the business's money, right? Are they actually cards owned by the business as opposed to Geoff personally? And I think an answer to that question would, come a long way in terms of maybe squashing some of this concern towards him as an individual. When people are saying, you know what, you've taken this government money, rightfully so, because your business was struggling at the time of COVID. You've taken it, but you've got it forgiven. How can you as an owner be comfortable getting it forgiven despite some of the things, I've already flagged with you, if you think those aren't possible, or if this is like the one chance where none of those things would be applied? When I say those things, I mean the things I mentioned earlier on in the video. And then you've used money to buy all these cards yourself. That's not a good look, right? The optics are quite poor. But if those cards he's buying that are under the persona of him being his PC cards, but they're actually the business cards, that might squash some of that stuff, right? Because in that separate Sports Card Investor business obviously has other directors, other partners, whatever you want to call them, people funding that business. So it's almost like a share effect in the sense that there multiple people are buying into those cards rather than Geoff just himself. But again, we can clarify those. If I do get a response, I've asked him the question, like I think I said a little bit earlier. If I do have a response, I'll put it down in the comments below and have it as a pinned comment, or put it in the description. If I don't get the response by the time this video comes out, just keep checking in. I'll probably do a post or something when it does come through an answer on that question. But essentially, that's my thought process on the Geoff Wilson situation. Now, as I think I said a little bit earlier, I don't think there's any fraud happening, just because the mandatory audit's going to find what it needs to have found, right? And the forgiveness portion also would have found what it needed to find, right? They're not just going to forgive a loan of that value if they didn't have appropriate recourse, right? And again, the question shouldn't be, you committed fraud, which some of the discussion point is actually happening, right? I think it needs to come down to the optics of him spending money when, maybe his business was struggling. Maybe he could have propped it up a little bit more. But like I said, those examples I gave a bit earlier probably indicate why that was not possible. But the other thing I do want to flag that I don't think is being talked about enough, and this is what's been a little bit annoying to me, right? Because people are jumping on to Geoff Wilson. I know you can hate him. I've called him out before on this channel, right? But I think the focus should also be going back to some of these businesses within the trading card hobby that are actually within the trading card hobby that have also taken money and had it forgiven, despite them being in probably the biggest gold rush boom that the trading card hobby has literally ever seen. And some of the ones that I haven't talked to that I'll put up on screen now that you may have seen in my Twitter thread the day I posted my last video, this stuff is just crazy. You've got David Adams Card World taking out $810,000 and having it forgiven 6 months later. And again, I had a few people confused as to what my point was of the last video, right? I'm not saying these companies were in the wrong to take this money in the first place, right? At the very start of 2020, this hobby the whole world actually was in a really dark state, right? We didn't know what was happening. We are being told where we could go, why we can't leave our house, so on and so forth. So the fact that these people took this money was a good thing because they have an obligation to their employees to make sure they can continue to put food on the table and pay their mortgages, okay? But the fact that we've seen them forgiven is where the issue is. Now, again, some of these things would have to go through a process to get approval on the forgiveness portion, okay? They would have to go back to the bank and say, either verbally or via written communication, and those things differed between banks, okay? I've seen it firsthand here in Australia, and I've spoken to colleagues in the US. Those things differed between each bank, okay? Some banks you could literally just call up and say, no, things are the same, and then you'd get your forgiveness, right? Which is utterly ridiculous. Some of you might say, well, why would the bank do that? Keep in mind, as I said earlier, these were government funded. So the government leveraged banks to get these loans approved and facilitated, right? They basically piggybacked off the bank's processes to make sure the banks were approving the correct customers. But at the same time, banks got a little bit slack in this instance. And I think we're going to see some banks globally get in trouble for this in the sense that some of them were too quick to forgive loans because they knew the government was just going to give them some of that money back, right? And they're hoping they're not going to get noticed. But you know, banks are going to get found out, in my opinion, just as much as individuals committing fraud within this process. I think we're going to see some banks get in trouble as well once the government realizes that there's forgiveness out there, loans forgiven that probably shouldn't have been, right? And I'm not saying that's what happened with this instance, but like, think of it from this perspective. How can you have loans forgiven for, you know, pillars of our trading card hobby, right? David Adams Cardboard is a huge business. Like, yes, at the same time, that is a large loan. How would they go about paying it back? They're basically boomed, okay? Some of these other businesses have boomed. Like some capacity, you would imagine they could start paying this sort of stuff back. And then the question comes as well, like how much money have they made during that period, right? Would them paying that loan back mean they didn't make the big profit that they would have? But would it have been the right thing? Like those are the questions I want you asking with this situation. Not like obviously focus in on sports card investor and ask questions about the optics, so on and so forth. But let's not forget about this crap either, right? This stuff is more blatant in my opinion. And this is crazy that people have stopped talking about these other businesses. You've got Upper Deck Company, which again, I flagged in my Twitter thread. They took out $2.2 million of loans and basically had the whole thing forgiven along with the accrued interest, which is interesting because that implies they probably didn't make any repayments at all on the original loan amount, which is why it's higher than what they originally borrowed, right? Utilities is quite high. I think that's the wrong line item. It's most likely rent. But again, Upper Deck obviously have a huge payroll. The whole factory couldn't operate, so on and so forth. So again, they needed that loan in the first place. But also keep in mind, Upper Deck, how much money do you think they made during this boom? Like, how did they get that forgiven? Now, there might be, you know, very justifiable reasons. And again, because this amount is over the $2 million threshold, it would have gone through more checks than some of these other ones did. So maybe they've got justifiable reasons. But again, how can you rationalize the hobby going through this huge boom and then seeing stuff like this? Did these businesses not actually make as much profit as we thought they were? Did they not operate as efficiently as they should have been? Like if we're at the point where they've got businesses like this making this kind of money, okay, and having to borrow these kinds of loans and getting them forgiven, and they got them forgiven despite being in a boom, are they really poorly operated? How could you go through the biggest gold rush that your industry will literally ever see and not capitalize on that? If these businesses are struggling so poorly during this process that they've had to get these loans forgiven, what does that mean for how they actually operate as a business? Like you almost have to be like brain dead in some capacity to not capitalize on that, right? Like it's literally turning on the faucet and money was coming out. That's how simple it should have been for some of these businesses. Now, one of the ones that I did flag in my video the other day was the PSA Collectors Universe situation. So this was one of the companies that I linked the article. You can sort of see it there. I think I linked it in one of my community posts on YouTube as well, where essentially there was a big group of businesses. I think there was like 50 or 60 that had a lot of public backlash with regards to trying to get their loans forgiven. PSA took out $4.2 million. These guys were trying, as I said the other day, to get this loan forgiven. They were trying to get this loan forgiven. $4.2 million. PSA. Seriously? Like, come on, guys. We then also got Check Out My Cards, which I don't think anybody else has flagged yet. $732,000 they had forgiven. Now, again, Check Out My Cards would have been hit extremely hard right at the start of the pandemic because they literally could not operate. They could not process anything. And if you recall, it got so bad for Check Out My Cards that their backlog got so huge, it was taking them like months and months to actually ship out your cards. So you can sort of understand from their perspective. But at the same time, think once the boom occurred, how many sales were transacted not only through Check Out My Cards, through their website, but also on eBay, the fees they were making on sales, all this sort of stuff. Do you really think they couldn't afford to pay back $732,000? Again, what I said earlier, I'm not accusing these businesses of anything, But those are the questions you need to be asking. And this is the kind of stuff I want us to be focusing on, as opposed to this sort of witch hunt with the sports card investor situation. Now, again, there could be some issues there, right? But the explanations I sort of explained, or the items I explained a little bit earlier, might indicate why that might not be the case. In the worst case, in my opinion, I think that's just really, really poor optics from an individual, right? Some of these stuff from these businesses, from these trading card businesses, could literally be fraud. And I think that sort of stuff cannot be swept under the rug. And currently it is. And I'd really appreciate if people started talking about that, a little bit more. And I'm not coming out to try and protect Geoff Wilson or Sports Card Investor or anything like that. You're free to literally do whatever you want. I explained my thought process based on what I've seen in my first-hand experience as an auditor, right? What I think is sort of happening. But all this other stuff, is being swept under the rug, swept aside to focus in on Geoff, when if what the people are saying about Geoff Wilson is true, then this stuff from these other trading card businesses, right, or from these actual trading card businesses, because the Sports Card Investor stuff is not a trading card business, this actual trading card business stuff is just as bad, if not worse, right? If people are looking at the Sports Card Investor situation and they're putting it up as one of the worst things to ever happen, this trading card business, at worst, is at the same level as that. So if you are in that boat, please start calling this stuff out a little bit more as well, because it's just utterly ridiculous that you've got businesses literally in the biggest gold rush that their industry is ever going to see, and they have to get loans forgiven. Like, how honestly idiotic and poorly operated do you actually need to be for that to occur? Now, again, based on what I've said before on this channel, I would not be shocked if that was the case. If there were so many businesses within this hobby that are absolutely so hopeless at actually operating, that this is what actually needed to occur. And I just said actually a lot, so I don't know why I did that, but you guys get what I'm trying to say, right? It's just utterly ridiculous, and I think it just boggles the freaking mind. Now, this video is going to be very long, almost 20 minutes. I hope you did stick around. If you didn't, that's still okay. I appreciate your support, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers. Bump the mic. I'm an idiot. See ya.